Another coin video. Until very recently in our history, what was something you could almost guarantee you would use every day? Coins, money. Today we're looking at a coin that was once the very definition of small beer in the British pocket. It's the farthing, worth just a quarter of an old penny. Can you remember your old money? There were 240 pennies to the pound, so a farthing was 1/960th of a pound. Basically the smallest real coin most folk would ever handle. And this little bronze disc was once an essential part of British life. Imagine trying to pay a tuppence bus fare with 8 farthings, and the conductor basically telling you to get stuffed. To many of us today, the idea of a coin worth less than 1/10 of a modern penny seems absurd, but for centuries every farthing counted. We'll be exploring its journey, not just as a piece of metal, but as a witness to the changing face of Britain. From its 700-year history to its final, somewhat unceremonious exit in the mid-20th century, the farthing tells a story of inflation, everyday struggles, and the eventual march of progress. Before we dive into the 20th century, we have to acknowledge where this little coin came from. The name farthing is a corruption of the Old English word feorthing, meaning a fourth part. In the early days, if you wanted a farthing, you didn't reach for a specific coin. You literally clipped a silver penny into 4 equal pieces. Official silver farthings eventually appeared under Henry III in the 13th century, but they were so tiny and light, weighing less than half a gram, that they were incredibly impractical and easy to lose. They eventually transitioned through tin and copper versions, often featuring the seated image of Britannia, a design that lasted for more than 250 years. In the Victorian era, the coin was reduced to the 20mm bronze size many of us might still recognise from that old tin in the sideboard. You know, that tin. Sewing needles, buttons, old coins, hair grips, perished elastic bands. Did your family have that tin? Everyone did, surely. And did you ever actually spend a farthing? The most famous version of the farthing, and the one held in the fondest memory, arrived in 1937. For over 2 centuries, Britannia had ruled the reverse of the coin, but she was replaced by a tiny, lively garden bird, the wren. It was an ideal metaphor, Britain's smallest bird on its smallest coin. And here's the little royal soap opera twist. The design was lined up for Edward VIII, but he's only gone and abdicated before coins with his head ever properly got out into circulation. So his wee brother Bertie ends up with the wren farthing instead. Turns out that Edward VIII actually broke long-standing tradition by insisting his portrait face left because he believed it was his better side. This was seen by some as a superstitious omen of bad luck, as monarchs are traditionally supposed to alternate the direction they face from their predecessor. When his brother, George VI, known in the family as Bertie, took the throne, the wren farthing finally made its public debut, featuring the new king's portrait, and George VI ends up facing left, basically as if Edward VIII would have faced right, so the tradition isn't broken. Now, you might wonder what you could actually buy with such a tiny amount of money in the mid-20th century. Believe it or not, the farthing's survival into the late 1950s was largely down to British bread laws. After the Second World War, the price of a standard £1 loaf was fixed by the government, and that price often included an old halfpenny. That's £1 in weight, by the way, roughly about 450 grams. This meant that if a housewife wanted to buy just a £1/2 loaf, the price would technically end in a farthing. It sounds daft now, but it meant farthings were still rattling around in tills because bread prices didn't land neatly on a halfpenny. Because of this, the farthing remained a staple of the high street and the local bakery. It was the coin for the little bits and bobs of everyday shopping. In earlier Victorian times, a single farthing could buy you 3 oysters with bread and butter on a London street, a value roughly equivalent to a £5 note in today's money. By the 1940s and 50s, that purchasing power had vanished, but the coin remained a necessary evil for receiving change at the baker's or the grocer's. It was a coin that represented the thriftiness of a post-war generation. By the time we reached the reign of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, the farthing was in serious trouble as inflation was gnawing away at its buying power. As prices rose, the real-world value of 1/960th of a pound became almost negligible. Commercial demand began to plummet, and the Royal Mint noticed that fewer and fewer people actually wanted the coins in their tills. This led to some rather testy encounters in daily life. I love this typically British bit. Letters to the Times newspaper during this period paint a vivid picture of a coin that had overstayed its welcome. One correspondent reported being refused point blank when trying to pay a 2-penny bus fare with 8 farthings. That actually happened. That's no way to treat Britain's tiniest coin and the most stubborn wee hanger-on in the old system. Even more shockingly, a newspaper vendor reportedly became outright abusive when a customer tried to pay for a paper with 6 farthings. Try that today and you'll be infamous on Facebook within minutes. Even though the coin was technically legal tender up to 1 shilling, the public was losing patience with a pocket full of tiny bronze discs that didn't seem to buy anything anymore. The decision to kill off the farthing wasn't just about public grumpiness, it was a cold hard economic necessity. By the mid-1950s, the cost of minting the coin was becoming increasingly difficult to justify given its vanishing value. In 1956, the Royal Mint struck the final batch of farthings. Fewer than 2 million were made that year, a massive drop from the peak of 33 million struck during the height of the war in 1943. Removing the farthing also cleared the way for future currency reforms. Officials were already contemplating a smaller penny and halfpenny to make commerce more convenient. The farthing had become a bottleneck on the system, a clunky fraction that served no real purpose in a world where a £1/2 of bread was no longer a life or death financial calculation. Commercial demand had dried up, and the tiny wren was no longer needed to balance the books of the British household. The end finally came on New Year's Day 1961. The farthing was officially demonetised, meaning it was no longer legal tender. And that was that. The little wren got the boot. Not even the RSPB could save that one. It was the first of the old LSD, pounds, shillings and pence coins to be scrapped as Britain slowly edged towards decimalisation, which would eventually arrive a decade later. While the coin was gone from the shops, it wasn't gone from people's hearts. That little farthing with the wren on it is still remembered with great affection by the generations who grew up with it. There was a certain sentimental attachment to the lowest coin in the realm. It has also left us with a linguistic legacy. We still use the phrase "not a brass farthing" to describe being penniless, and the iconic penny-farthing bicycle got its name because its wheels, one huge and one tiny, resembled the 2 coins placed side by side. Today, farthings are a favourite for collectors because they are relatively plentiful and feature such a vast range of varieties. If you're lucky enough to find a Victorian young head copper farthing from 1860 in very fine condition, it could be worth around £3,500 to £4,000 today. Not a bad return for a quarter of a penny. The farthing may have been small, but its journey from silver quarters to the beloved wren bird is a 700-year epic, It reminds us that even the smallest parts of our history can tell the biggest stories. So whatever happened to the farthing? Inflation happened. Bread pricing kept it on life support for years, but by the 1950s it was basically a nuisance, and by the 1st of January 1961 it was finished as legal tender. But it left behind a cracking little legacy, the sayings, the memories, and that wren design people still love. Have you ever found one in a jar, a tin, or hiding at the back of a drawer? Let me know below. And just as I'm writing this script, in January 2026, another big bank has announced it's closing dozens of branches. Will bricks and mortar branches and real tangible money eventually become consigned to British history? I very rarely handle cash nowadays and haven't been inside a bank for probably 15 years or more. What about you?